My fiancé, Liam, leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear as my parents bustled around the kitchen, laughing about something my brother Leo had done. His voice was a low whisper, a stark contrast to the clatter of plates and the forced joviality that always filled their house. "Vic, don't make a sound, but look at the paper on the corner of the counter, the one half tucked under the mail basket." I held my breath, my fork hovering over a piece of dry chicken. I followed his gaze discreetly. It was a thick piece of bond paper, cream-colored, with an official-looking letterhead from a firm I'd never heard of. It was clearly a financial statement, folded carelessly, as if it were nothing more than junk mail. "I think your mum pulled it out of the shred pile by mistake," he continued, his eyes fixed on his own plate, giving nothing away. "I just saw the account total when she moved the basket. Whatever you do, don't let them know you've seen it. Just read it later. I think this is it." My blood ran cold. This is it. For the past year, he had been my anchor in a sea of doubt, the quiet voice that affirmed my own screaming intuition. And that quiet warning, that simple, urgent instruction, in the middle of a painfully normal family dinner, was the key that unlocked 2 decades of lies I had been conditioned to accept as love. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Looking back, the signs were always there, written in a language of casual cruelty I was conditioned to ignore. My family operated on a 2-tiered system, a caste system of 2, and I was born into the lower one. There was the Leo tier, and then there was mine. Leo, my older brother by 2 years, was the golden child, the sun around which my parents' world orbited. His needs were not just met, they were anticipated and lavishly catered to. A new convertible for his 16th birthday, a top-of-the-line gaming computer for Christmas that cost more than my first car, his university tuition and living expenses paid in full without a second thought, allowing him to coast through a business degree with mediocre grades. I remember one Christmas vividly. I was 17 and had been saving up for months for a decent laptop for college. I'd asked for a specific, mid-range model. On Christmas morning, Leo unwrapped a massive box containing a state-of-the-art desktop computer with 3 monitors, a machine built for professional gaming. My gift was a new sweater and a gift certificate to a bookstore. When I couldn't hide my disappointment, my mother pulled me aside. "Victoria, Leo needs this for his networking," she'd whispered, as if that explained it. "You're so practical. We knew you'd find a way to get what you needed." My milestones were marked with a different kind of parental attention, the kind that emphasized character building. For my 16th birthday, I received a lecture on the importance of saving for my own vehicle and a reloadable bus pass. For my high school graduation, I got a firm handshake from my father and a reminder that student loan applications were due. The financial disparity was so blatant, so deeply ingrained in our family's fabric, that for a long time I just assumed it was a fundamental law of our universe. I was the responsible one, the practical one, the one who didn't need things. Leo was the one with potential that needed nurturing with cash. It was a narrative they sold me, and for 18 years I bought it wholesale, eager for their approval. "You're so good with money, Victoria," my mother would say, a placating smile on her face whenever I questioned why Leo needed another $500 for a weekend trip, while I was working 20 hours a week at a diner to pay for my textbooks. "We don't have to worry about you." It was framed as a compliment, but it was really a cage, a justification for their neglect. It was their excuse for providing me with the bare minimum, while showering him with everything. They weren't just parents, they were Leo's lifelong sponsors, and I was the perpetual, unpaid intern in the family business of propping him up. My role was to be understanding, to be quiet, to not rock the boat. I was the designated driver at a demolition derby, expected to stay sober and sensible while everyone else got to have all the destructive fun. I was the quiet, responsible foundation upon which the Temple of Leo was built, and I was starting to realize that my foundation was cracking under the weight of their blatant favoritism. The phrase that echoed through my childhood and into my early 20s was always the same, a 4-word shutdown of any uncomfortable inquiry. "You're too young to understand." It was the ultimate conversation ender, a brick wall they threw up whenever I got too close to a truth they didn't want me to see. When I was 15 and asked why Leo's expensive summer camps were a necessity while my request for a simple art class was an unaffordable luxury, I was too young to understand budgeting. When I asked why Leo's college fund was a topic of nightly discussion while mine was met with awkward silence and a suggestion to look for scholarships, I was too young to understand the complexities of long-term financial planning. "It's about projected earnings, sweetheart," my father had explained once, patting my head in a condescending gesture. "Leo's on a track for a high-powered career. We have to invest in that. Your interests are quieter." My love for art and literature was dismissed as a hobby, not a viable future worth investing in. When I was 19, working 2 jobs to cover my rent and tuition after they couldn't afford to help, I was too young to understand the pressures of running a household and managing a mortgage. They were masters of the condescending dismissal, painting me as a naive child who simply couldn't grasp the sophisticated burdens of adulthood they were shouldering. It was a brilliant, insidious tactic. It didn't just shut down the conversation, it invalidated my reality. It made me feel like the problem wasn't the glaring inequality, but my own immaturity. Liam was the first person to call it what it was: gaslighting. He came into my life during my sophomore year of college, a calm, observant force of nature who saw through the facade my family had so carefully constructed. We met in a literature class, and he was struck by how I spoke about my family with a kind of resigned frustration. I remember one evening, curled up on his dorm room sofa, crying after a phone call with my mum. I'd asked if they could possibly help with a few $100s for a required textbook, and she'd launched into a 20-minute tirade about their tight budget, only to mention in the same breath that they'd just booked a cruise. I was venting, expecting him to just nod and sympathize. Instead, he asked, "Does that make sense to you? A $2,000 cruise versus a $200 textbook?" It was so simple, but no one had ever asked me that before. He never told me what to think, but he would ask questions that poked holes in their flimsy excuses. He held up a mirror to my life, and for the first time I saw the distorted reflection of their lies, instead of my own supposed inadequacy. He was the catalyst, the external validator who gave me permission to trust my own gut. My gut had been screaming for years that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Liam just gave me the courage to finally listen to it. He made me realize they weren't protecting me from a complex adult world, they were protecting a secret from a daughter they had severely underestimated. The evening, Liam pointed out, the document was just another typical family dinner, a mandatory weekly ritual that felt more like a parole hearing than a celebration of kinship. The air was thick with my mother's forced cheerfulness and my father's gruff indifference. Leo was, as usual, holding court, regaling us with a story about a hilarious mishap at his high-paying job, a job my father's connections had secured for him. He was complaining, in a bragging sort of way, about having to fly business class instead of first class on a recent trip. The legroom was just abysmal, he lamented, as my mother nodded sympathetically. I could barely concentrate on my pre-meeting prep. I was playing my part, smiling and nodding, a ventriloquist dummy of familial harmony, a role I had perfected over 2 decades. After Liam's whispered warning, the rest of the dinner was a blur. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the monotonous drone of their conversation. I felt a cold dread mix with a strange, thrilling sense of validation. He saw it too. I wasn't crazy. I focused on moving my food around my plate, the taste of ashes in my mouth. I couldn't look at my parents without seeing a question mark hanging over their heads. Every laugh, every casual remark seemed calculated and false. When my mum finally turned her back to load the dishwasher, her movements fussy and deliberate, I saw my chance. With a feigned yawn and a stretch, I announced I should get going. I walked over to the counter to collect my purse, my body acting as a shield between my mother and the damning piece of paper. My hand trembled as I deftly slid the folded statement from under the mail basket and slipped it into my bag. It felt like an act of espionage in my own home. The paper felt heavy, important, like a piece of evidence that could either exonerate them or convict them. The drive home was excruciatingly silent. Liam didn't push. He just drove, one hand resting on my knee in a gesture of solidarity. The air in the car crackled with unspoken questions. I kept replaying his words. I think this is it. It felt like we were on the verge of a cliff, and I had no idea what was at the bottom. Back in our small apartment, I pulled out the statement and unfolded it on our coffee table with trembling hands. The letterhead was from a prestigious wealth management firm, one I associated with old money and sprawling estates. The account holders were listed as my parents, David and Carol. And below their names, in smaller print, was the title that made the floor drop out from under me: The Miller Grandchildren's Irrevocable Trust. Miller was my mother's maiden name. My grandparents. I scanned the page, my eyes blurring, searching for the number Liam had seen, and then I found it, a balance so large it made me feel dizzy. It was a life-changing amount of money, an astronomical sum that made every lie they had ever told me, every penny I had ever scraped together, feel like a profound and personal insult. There were 2 beneficiaries listed: Leo Miller Jones and Victoria Miller Jones. We sat there for a long time, the trust fund statement lying between us like a quiet bomb. An irrevocable trust. I knew enough from a business law class I had taken as an elective to understand what that meant. It was set in stone. My parents were the trustees, the managers, but the money wasn't theirs to do with as they pleased. It belonged to the beneficiaries. It belonged to Leo and me. A cold, hard anger, the kind that feels clarifying and sharp, began to replace the initial shock. Every memory of financial struggle, every moment of shame and anxiety replayed in my mind, but this time they were cast in the sickening glow of this newfound knowledge. I remembered the time my car broke down on the highway when I was 20. It was late at night, raining, and utterly terrifying. The repair bill was over $1,000, a catastrophic amount for me at the time. I had called my parents from the grimy waiting room of the repair shop, choking back tears of humiliation, and begged for a loan. I remember my father's heavy sigh, the lecture about budgeting and the importance of an emergency fund I couldn't possibly afford to have. "We're stretched thin right now, Victoria," he had said, his voice laced with disappointed authority. "We can't just bail you out every time. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I ended up taking on a high-interest payday loan, a decision that haunted me for over a year as I worked extra shifts to pay it off. Now, looking at the trust statement, I could see the transaction history for that quarter. Just 2 weeks before my car broke down, there had been a withdrawal. A 5-figure withdrawal, categorized as an educational, housing expense disbursement. I didn't even have to guess where it went. I remembered Leo showing off his brand new, top-of-the-line home theater system around that same time, bragging about the sweet deal he got. The sweet deal was my emergency fund. It was my security. It was my money. I remembered another time, a year later, when I got a severe toothache. I needed a root canal, and my part-time job didn't offer dental insurance. The cost was astronomical. I asked them for help, and they loaned me $1,000, but they made me sign a repayment contract, with interest. They made me feel like a charity case. On this statement, from that same month, was a $10,000 withdrawal for Leo, vehicle purchase. They were charging me interest on a loan while handing him a new car with my own money. My parents hadn't been stretched thin. They had been actively liquidating my future to finance his present. This wasn't just about unfairness or favoritism anymore. This was a calculated, long-term deception. It was theft. The phrase "stand on your own 2 feet" now sounded like a cruel joke. They had sawed off one of my legs and then admonished me for not being able to stand. The rage I felt was so pure and so potent it almost felt peaceful. For the first time, I wasn't confused or hurt. I was simply, incandescently, angry. Liam, ever the pragmatist, immediately shifted into research mode while I was still reeling from the initial shock. "Okay," he said, his voice steadying my shaking hands. "We need more information. This is just one statement. We need to understand the whole picture before we do anything." For the next 2 weeks, we became private investigators in our own lives, operating with a level of secrecy that felt both absurd and necessary. It started with my old room at my parents' house. On the pretext of retrieving some old photo albums for a wedding slideshow idea, I went over one afternoon when I knew they would be out playing golf. My hands trembled as I sifted through the old filing cabinet in my father's home office, a place that had always been forbidden territory. The room smelled of old paper and his cloying aftershave. I felt like a trespasser, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and righteous fury. I focused on my breathing, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through me. Tucked away in a folder mislabeled Old Tax Returns, I found it. The trust's originating documents, bound in a faded blue folder. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had set it up years ago, just after I was born. They weren't wealthy people, but they were frugal schoolteachers who had invested wisely their entire lives. They had left this legacy to ensure their grandchildren would have a head start in life, a cushion against the world. I read through the legal jargon, my blood turning to ice. The language was crystal clear. The trust was to be managed by my parents until each beneficiary reached the age of 25, at which point their half of the principal and accrued interest was to be disbursed to them directly. Leo was 27. I was 3 months shy of my 25th birthday. The document confirmed my worst fears. Leo had been receiving his share, and likely more, for 2 years. I had been kept completely in the dark, treated like a financial burden, while my own inheritance was being used as a slush fund for my brother. The phrase, "you're too young to understand," now felt less like a condescending dismissal and more like a strategic piece of brainwashing, a mantra they repeated to keep me from asking the right questions. They didn't think I was too young to understand finance. They were terrified I was old enough to understand their betrayal. The more I dug, the uglier it got. I found a whole file of statements. There were receipts for Leo's down payment on his condo, bank transfers to his account labeled gift, and even records of them paying off his substantial credit card debt. I found receipts for his designer clothes, his vacations with friends, even a bill from a high-end restaurant for his birthday party, all paid for from the trust. It was all there, a meticulously documented history of their deceit, paid for by my grandparents' legacy and my own ignorance. I took pictures of every single page with my phone, my hands shaking so badly that some of them were blurred. It was a treasure map of their treachery. The weeks leading up to my 25th birthday were the longest of my life, a surreal exercise in deception that mirrored my parents' own. Armed with the truth, every interaction with my family became a performance. I had to pretend that I didn't know I was sitting across the dinner table from the architects of my lifelong financial struggle. I had to smile and nod as my mother talked about the importance of family, all while knowing their definition of family was a pyramid scheme with me at the bottom. The anger simmered just below my surface, a constant, low-grade fever. It was exhausting to keep the mask on, to listen to their mundane complaints about property taxes or the price of gas, knowing that they had a secret fortune they were withholding from me. One phone call was particularly difficult. My mother called to chat, and she spent 10 minutes complaining about a recent plumbing bill. "Everything is just so expensive these days," she sighed dramatically. "Your father and I are trying to be so careful." I nearly choked. I had just reviewed a statement showing they'd spent $5,000 from the trust on a new patio set for their backyard the previous month. I just murmured sympathetically, the lie like acid in my throat. The hypocrisy was a physical presence in the room, a guest at every meal. Liam was my anchor through it all. We spent our evenings huddled together, poring over the copies of the documents I had taken, creating a timeline of their deception. We made an appointment with a financial advisor and then an estate lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Davies, whom a friend had recommended. Sitting in her quiet, professional office, I laid out the story and the documents, half expecting her to tell me I was misinterpreting things. But she didn't. Her expression grew more and more grim as she reviewed the evidence. As trustees, their legal obligation is to the beneficiaries, not to their own preferences, she explained, her voice crisp and clear. Their duty is to act in the best interest of both of you, equally. Withholding information about the trust's existence from a known beneficiary is a serious violation. Using your share to benefit the other beneficiary is even worse. This is a textbook case of breach of fiduciary duty. Her words were like a balm on a raw wound. It wasn't just in my head, it was real. It was illegal. We planned our strategy meticulously. There would be no more quiet acceptance, no more backing down to keep the peace. The peace had always been a lie anyway. It was just the silence of my own compliance. We decided to wait for my birthday. There was a grim poetry to it, confronting them on the very day they were legally obligated to turn over my inheritance, a day they had clearly intended to let pass in silence. I felt like I was preparing for battle, arming myself with facts and legal precedents instead of swords and shields. The old Victoria, the one who would have done anything to avoid a confrontation, was gone. She had died somewhere between the discovery of the first bank statement and the confirmation of her parents' betrayal. In her place was a woman who was finally ready to demand what was hers. My 25th birthday arrived on a crisp autumn Saturday. My parents had insisted on hosting a small family dinner. Just us, my mother had chirped over the phone, a quiet celebration for our girl. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Our girl, whose future they had been secretly auctioning off to fund their favorite son. I felt a strange, cold calm as Liam and I drove to their house, the original trust documents nestled safely in my briefcase on the back seat. This was it. The culmination of months of silent rage and careful planning. The house looked the same as it always had, a perfect suburban picture of happy family life, complete with manicured lawn and a seasonal wreath on the door. But now I saw the cracks in the facade, the rot underneath the fresh coat of paint. My brother Leo was already there, lounging on the sofa, scrolling through his phone as if he owned the place, which, in a way, I suppose he did. He grunted a happy birthday in my direction without looking up. My parents smothered me in hugs that felt cloying and false, their skin papery against mine. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed, pressing a small, neatly wrapped box into my hands. I knew, even before I opened it, that it would be something thoughtless and cheap, a token gesture to maintain the illusion of their affection. I was right. Inside was a scented candle, vanilla and sandalwood. It was a pleasant enough scent, but I noticed the wick was slightly blackened, and a faint ring of melted wax clung to the inside of the glass. I think the candle was used. A small, hysterical laugh bubbled in my chest. It was so perfectly, so tragically them. They had siphoned away a fortune that was rightfully mine, and their celebratory gift was a used candle. So, I'm a collage. That's fun. Liam squeezed my hand, his presence a silent reminder of the plan. We would wait until after dinner. We would let them play out their little charade one last time. I sat through the meal, a ghost at my own feast. My mother served my favorite meal, a dry roast chicken I'd hated since I was 12. I pushed food around my plate and offered non-committal hums as they chatted on about their lives, about Leo's promotion, about their upcoming vacation to a resort I now knew my money was funding. The entire time, I could feel the weight of the documents in my briefcase, a silent testament to the truth that was about to blow their comfortable world apart. After the plates were cleared, and a sad little store-bought cake with crooked candles was presented, my father leaned back in his chair, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He loved playing the part of the benevolent patriarch. "Well, Victoria," he said, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "A quarter of a century, you're officially an old woman." Leo snickered from the couch where he'd already retreated. My mother smiled benignly, clapping her hands together softly. This was my opening, the one Miss Davies and I had rehearsed. I took a deep breath, the cold calm solidifying into steel in my veins. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the light-hearted banter like a shard of glass. "There is something I'd like to discuss. It's about the Miller grandchildren's irrevocable trust." The silence that fell over the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the space. My father's smile froze and then vanished, replaced by a stony mask, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. My mother's hand flew to her chest in a gesture of feigned theatrical shock, her eyes wide. Leo finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of genuine confusion, quickly replaced by a guarded wariness, in his eyes. He knew that name. "I don't know what you're talking about," my father said, his voice low and dangerous. It was the tone he always used when he was about to shut me down, the vocal equivalent of a slammed door. But it didn't work anymore. I met his gaze without flinching. "I think you do," I said calmly. I stood up, my movements deliberate and slow, savoring the shift in power. I walked over to the living room, retrieved my briefcase, and placed it on the dining table with a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. I opened it and pulled out the copies of the trust documents, the quarterly statements I'd found, and the bank statements I'd managed to photograph. I laid them out, one by one, like a dealer laying out a royal flush, a paper trail of their grand deception. I'm talking about the trust my grandparents, Nana and Papa Miller, set up for me and Leo. The one you've been managing. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, and hiding from me, for my entire life. The one I was supposed to receive my half of today, on my 25th birthday. My voice didn't waver. The girl who used to cry when her father used that tone was gone. I had the truth on my side, and it was a better shield than I'd ever had before. My mother was the first to break the stunned silence. She let out a shaky, theatrical laugh, a sound like tearing silk. "Victoria, sweetheart, you're being so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern as she reached a hand across the table towards me, a hand I ignored. "This is just some boring old family paperwork. You've completely misunderstood. Your father handles all of that. It's far too complicated for you to worry about." This was their classic move, immediate denial followed by a swift pivot to gaslighting. I was the one who was confused, emotional, dramatic. The problem wasn't their actions, but my reaction. She even tried to claim, for a moment, that perhaps the trust was only ever intended for Leo. "Your grandparents always saw his potential," she mused, a desperate, transparent lie. "I'm sure it's just a mistake in the paperwork that your name is on it." "I haven't misunderstood anything," I replied, my voice devoid of the hysteria she was trying to provoke. I tapped my finger on the specific clause in the trust agreement that I had highlighted in yellow. "It says right here, upon reaching the age of 25, each beneficiary is to be granted full access to their 50% share of the trust. My name is here. Today is my birthday. Where is my share?" My father took a different approach. He went on the offensive, his face turning a blotchy, angry red. "This is a private family matter," he growled, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "You had no right to go snooping through my office. This is a complete violation of our trust. Unbelievable. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of him accusing me of violating his trust was almost laughable. "Your trust?" I shot back, a real incredulous laugh escaping my lips this time. "You want to talk about trust? Let's talk about the $24,000 withdrawal made 2 years ago, right before Leo suddenly had a down payment for his condo. Or the monthly $5,000 transfers to his account, labeled living expenses. Let's talk about how you told me you were stretched thin when my car broke down, while you were actively funneling money from my inheritance to him." I had the statement spread out like a winning poker hand. For every lie they tried to tell, I had a documented, dated, undeniable truth to counter it. Leo, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice whiny and defensive, the voice of a spoiled child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "I needed that money." "You wouldn't understand, Vic. You've always been so simple. Your life isn't as demanding as mine. Simple, that's what he called it. My years of budgeting, of working multiple jobs, of carefully managing my debt, were simple. His profligate, irresponsible lifestyle, funded by my money, was apparently complex and necessary. The insult was so profound, so revealing of their entire worldview, that it barely registered as a sting. It was just another piece of evidence. The confrontation escalated into a chaotic storm of accusations and denials, a masterclass in toxic family dynamics. My parents cycled through their entire arsenal of manipulation tactics with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. They tried guilt. "After everything we've done for you," my mother cried, real tears now streaming down her face, a sight that used to shatter me. "We gave you a roof over your head. We fed you. This is how you repay us? By making these wild accusations on your birthday?" She brought up a time they'd co-signed a small loan for me in college, holding it up as an example of their endless generosity, conveniently ignoring that the loan was necessary because they were withholding my inheritance. They tried to divide and conquer, turning to Liam, hoping to find a weak link. "Liam, you're a sensible young man," my father said, attempting a reasonable man-to-man tone that was laughably transparent. "Surely you can see she's overreacting. She's always been prone to hysterics, even as a little girl. You have to know how to handle her." But Liam didn't flinch. He simply moved to stand directly behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders, a silent, solid wall of support. "With all due respect, Miss Miller," he said, his voice firm and even, "I've seen the documents. Victoria isn't overreacting. She's responding to a significant breach of trust. A breach of your legal fiduciary duty, to be precise." The word fiduciary hung in the air like a guillotine. It was a word they couldn't dismiss as emotional or dramatic. It was a legal term, and it carried the weight of consequences. My father's face paled. Then they tried to rewrite history, to paint themselves as benevolent protectors. "We were protecting you, Victoria," my mother insisted, shifting her narrative seamlessly. "You were never responsible with money. Remember that credit card in college? We were afraid you'd just waste it all. We were going to tell you when you were older, more mature, ready to handle it." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They called me financially irresponsible while they were secretly embezzling my inheritance to pay off my brother's credit card debt from a trip to Vegas. They were the financial arsonists, and they were trying to blame me for the fire. Throughout it all, I remained surprisingly calm. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my stomach, but it had been forged into something sharp and focused. I was no longer the confused, hurt girl they could easily manipulate. I was a woman who knew her rights, armed with irrefutable proof of their wrongdoing. I let them exhaust themselves, their lies growing more desperate and contradictory with each passing minute. I watched as the perfect family they had built for themselves crumbled into dust right before their eyes, revealing the ugly, selfish truth that had been hiding underneath all along. Finally, when their arguments had devolved into pathetic, circular reasoning and my mother's weeping had subsided into hiccuping self-pity, I held up my hand. The gesture was small, but it carried an authority they had never seen from me before, and it silenced them. "I'm done listening to this," I said, my voice cutting through the noise with chilling finality. "The time for discussion, for excuses, for lies, is over." I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a scene in a movie. The fear I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This was not a negotiation, it was a sentencing. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out one last document. It was a letter from Ms. Davies, my lawyer, printed on her firm's official, embossed letterhead. I slid it across the table towards my father. He recoiled as if it were a snake. "You have two options," I stated, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I was no longer asking, I was dictating terms. "Option 1, you cooperate fully. You will provide a complete, notarized accounting of the trust from the day you became trustees. You will immediately transfer my 50% share of the current balance, including all interest that should have accrued had it not been improperly withdrawn, into an account of my choosing. You will also repay, from your own funds, every single dollar that was taken from my share and given to Leo or used for your own benefit. We can handle this privately, through our lawyers. It will be expensive and humiliating for you, but it will be private." My father scoffed, a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control, though he looked shaken to his core. "And option 2? He asked, his voice dripping with a disdain he clearly didn't feel. "Option 2, I said, meeting his gaze and holding it, feeling the last vestiges of my childhood fear of him burn away to nothing, "is that I walk out of this house, drive directly to my lawyer's office, and instruct her to hand all of this evidence, every statement, every receipt, the trust document itself over to the district attorney. We will pursue criminal charges for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. We will also file a civil suit for damages. Everything will become public record. I'm sure a judge, and all of your golf buddies, and everyone at your church, would be very interested to see how you've been protecting my assets all these years." The threat of legal action, of public humiliation, and potential jail time was the one weapon they had no defense against. My mother let out a small gasp. Leo looked like he was going to be sick. My father, for the first time in my entire life, looked truly defeated. He stared at the lawyer's letter, then at me, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't feeling remorse, he was weighing the cost. He was a businessman, and he knew a bad deal when he saw one. The fight was over. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of their ruined lives. I had won. The aftermath was as ugly and drawn out as I expected, a slow, painful extraction of truth and money. My parents, choosing the lesser of two evils, agreed to option one, but they didn't make it easy. They viewed cooperation not as a consequence of their actions, but as a negotiation in which they could still try to win. They dragged their feet at every opportunity, forcing my lawyer to send a barrage of sternly worded letters and make threatening phone calls. They quibbled over every expense, tried to justify lavish vacations as family bonding experiences that I had technically benefited from, and even attempted to claim that some of the money given to Leo was a loan he intended to pay back. At one point, they accidentally sent my lawyer an incomplete set of financial records. Miss Davies was not amused. "This is a stalling tactic, plain and simple," she told me over the phone. "We're giving them 24 hours to produce the rest, or we file." The complete records appeared the next morning. They tried every trick in the book to hide the true extent of their financial mismanagement, but the paper trail was undeniable, a clear and damning narrative of their greed. The full accounting, when it was finally produced under threat of subpoena, was even more shocking than I had imagined. It turned out they hadn't just been funding Leo's lavish lifestyle. They had been using my trust money to pay for their own vacations to Europe, a new luxury car for my mother, and even to make investments in my father's failing side business. They had treated my inheritance like their personal piggy bank for years. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. This wasn't a simple case of favoring one child over another. This was a systematic, calculated plundering of my future for their own selfish gain. During this period, they launched a full-scale emotional warfare campaign against me. My mother would call me, weeping, telling me I was tearing the family apart, that I was putting her and my father under unbearable stress. My father would send terse, guilt-inducing emails about how my aggression was affecting my mother's delicate health. They even tried to turn my extended family against me, spinning a tale about how I had become greedy and ungrateful, manipulated by my fiancé into trying to extort my loving parents. A few relatives took the bait. I had one particularly awful phone call with my aunt, my mother's sister. "Family is family, Victoria," she'd lectured. "You don't do this to your own parents. You need to learn to forgive." I calmly replied, "Did they tell you they stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from me?" The line went quiet for a long moment before she mumbled an excuse and hung up. I blocked her number. Forgiveness was a privilege, not a right, and they had done nothing to earn it. Family loyalty, I realized, was a one-way street in their world. My loyalty was expected, demanded even, while their loyalty to me was conditional and, ultimately, non-existent. Through it all, Liam was my rock. He fielded angry phone calls, read through legal documents with me, and held me when the sheer weight of their betrayal felt too heavy to bear. He reminded me that I wasn't destroying a family. I was escaping a toxic, abusive system. The final financial settlement was a day of quiet, profound vindication. It didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic courtroom scene, but with a simple phone call from Ms. Davies. "Victoria," she said, a note of satisfaction in her professional voice. "It's done. The funds have been transferred." When she told me the final number, I had to sit down. The sheer magnitude of it was overwhelming. It was not just my original half of the trust. It was the accrued interest calculated over the years, plus the significant sum my parents and Leo were forced to repay from their own assets to cover what they had stolen and mismanaged. It was a number that represented not just money, but years of lies, years of struggle, years of being told I was less than. To come up with the money, they had to take out a second mortgage on their house, the very house they had filled with expensive things using my money. Leo was forced to sell his precious condo, the one that had been the first major clue in their web of deceit. The tangible consequences of their actions were finally, inescapably real for them. I felt no joy in their hardship, only a grim sense of justice. Their financial pain was a direct result of the emotional and financial pain they had inflicted on me for over 2 decades. That same afternoon, a package arrived by courier. It was from my mother. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside was a photo album, the kind with the sticky plastic pages that always lost their grip over time. It was filled with pictures of me as a child, a smiling toddler in a sandbox, an awkward preteen with braces, a hopeful high school graduate in a cap and gown. On the first page, she had written a note in her looping, dramatic handwriting. "I don't know who you are anymore," it read. "I hope all this money makes you happy. I've lost my daughter." It was one last desperate attempt at manipulation, one final try to cast me as the villain and herself as the grieving mother. I looked through the photos, seeing a girl who was desperate for approval, who contorted herself into the shape of the good daughter to earn even a fraction of the love that flowed so effortlessly to her brother. I saw a picture of me at my high school graduation, smiling brightly, not knowing that the college savings they claimed not to have were very real, and sitting in an account they were actively hiding from me. I didn't recognize that naive girl either, and for that, I was grateful. I took the album and the used candle they had given me for my birthday, and I put them in a box in the back of my closet. I wasn't going to throw them away. They were a reminder of who I used to be, and a reminder of why I could never go back. I hadn't lost a family. I had lost an illusion. And what I had gained in its place was the truth, my freedom, and a future that was finally, unequivocally, my own. Life after the storm was quieter than I expected, and at first, the silence was deafening. The constant barrage of manipulative texts and tearful phone calls eventually ceased, replaced by a vast, unnerving void. For the first few weeks, I felt a phantom limb of anxiety, constantly checking my phone, bracing for the next attack, the next guilt trip, the next demand, but it never came. The silence wasn't empty, it was peaceful. It was the absence of the constant low-level stress I had lived with for my entire life, the stress of trying to navigate their emotional minefield and anticipate their needs while suppressing my own. Liam and I took the money, and we built a new life, one based on our own values, not the dysfunctional ones I had inherited. We put a down payment on a small house in a town a few hours away, a place where we had no history, no ghosts to haunt our hallways. The day we got the keys was one of the proudest of my life. Walking through the empty rooms, the smell of fresh paint in the air, I didn't feel the shadow of my family's generosity or the weight of a debt I could never repay. This was mine, ours. We spent a whole weekend just painting the living room a ridiculous sunny yellow, laughing and getting more paint on ourselves than on the walls. It was the simplest, most joyful act of creation. We were building our own home, literally and figuratively. We were smart with the rest of the funds. We met with the same financial advisor who had helped me understand the trust, a kind, patient woman who celebrated my victory with genuine warmth. We set up a solid investment plan for long-term security, a concept that felt like the ultimate luxury. We also used a portion of it as seed money to start our own business, a small graphic design firm that had always been Liam's dream and my creative passion. Pouring our energy into building something positive, something that was entirely ours, from the logo design to the client contracts, was the most healing thing I could have imagined. It was a tangible symbol of our new beginning. We were constructing a future on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the house of lies I had grown up in. The money was a tool, a powerful one that opened doors I never dreamed possible, but it wasn't the prize. The real prize was the freedom. The freedom to make my own choices, to trust my own judgment, and to live a life free from the suffocating weight of their expectations and deceit. The silence wasn't an absence, it was the sound of my own life, finally beginning. About a year after the confrontation, when the dust had truly settled and my new life had started to feel normal, I received an email from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since I was a teenager. She was on my mother's side of the family, a woman I remembered as being quiet and observant at family gatherings. The subject line was simply, "Thinking of you." I hesitated before opening it, my finger hovering over the delete button, bracing for a lecture or a plea for reconciliation on behalf of my parents. Instead, it was a quiet, tentative apology. "I heard what happened," she wrote. "My mom told me your mom's version, and then I heard some other things from Uncle Robert. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I never knew the details about the money, but we all knew how they treated Leo versus how they treated you. We saw it at Christmas, at birthdays. No one ever said anything, and we should have. It was easier to pretend it wasn't happening. I hope you're happy, Victoria. You deserve it. Reading her words, I felt a complex wave of emotions. There was a surge of the old anger, a bitterness towards the silent observers, the family members who had stood by silently, complicit in their inaction. But beneath that was a profound sense of validation that washed over me like a cleansing rain. I wasn't crazy, it wasn't in my head. Other people had seen the disparity, the casual cruelty, the unfairness. They had just chosen to look away, to not get involved, to keep the peace. Her email was a small crack in the wall of silence that had protected my parents for so long. It was a confirmation that the family myth of my being dramatic or ungrateful was just that, a myth they spun to control the narrative. The truth had a way of seeping out, even if it took years. I wrote back a short, polite email, thanking her for her words. I didn't feel the need to rehash the past or demand a bigger apology. Her small act of reaching out was enough. It sparked a conversation between me and Liam later that night. "It's sad, isn't it?" I said, staring at the ceiling. "That all those people saw and did nothing." Liam was quiet for a moment. "It's hard to stand up to people like your parents," he said. "It's easier to just go along. What you did took a kind of courage most people don't have." Her email, and his words, helped me reframe it. It wasn't just about my family's betrayal, but also about my own strength in confronting it. It was a sign that the story they had tried so hard to control was no longer solely theirs to tell. The truth belonged to me now, and it was a truth others were finally willing to acknowledge. It was another small step on the road to healing, a reminder that breaking free from a toxic system can sometimes, unexpectedly, let a little light in from the most unlikely of places. One of the strangest and most difficult parts of my new life was recalibrating my own sense of worth. For so long, my value had been intrinsically tied to my utility within the family structure. I was the responsible one, the low-maintenance one, the one who never asked for too much. My role was to be the stable, uncomplaining background character in the grand drama of Leo's life. Breaking free from that role was liberating, but also deeply disorienting. For months I struggled with a kind of financial vertigo. I had the means to buy whatever I wanted, within reason, but I would stand in a grocery store and agonize over buying the brand-name pasta instead of the generic. I had been programmed for scarcity, and my brain was struggling to update its software. I had to learn to ask for things, not just from others, but from myself. I had to internalize the fact that my needs and wants were valid on their own, not just in comparison to my brothers. Liam was instrumental in this process. He would gently challenge the old, ingrained habits. When we were looking at houses, I would consistently gravitate towards the smallest, most practical options, my mind still stuck in a mindset of making myself small. He would be the one to point out the larger house with the beautiful garden and the extra room for a studio. "You're allowed to want nice things, Vic," he would say, taking my hand. "You're allowed to take up space." It was a slow, deliberate process of unlearning 2.5 decades of conditioning. I started small. I bought myself a new, high-quality laptop for work, instead of trying to make my old, dying one last another year. The first time I walked into a nice clothing store and bought a coat without checking the price tag first, I almost had a panic attack. But then, wearing it out of the store, I felt a sense of empowerment. It wasn't about the money, it was about the permission. I signed up for that pottery class I'd always wanted to take and discovered I was actually good at it. Each small act of prioritizing my own happiness was a victory, a reclamation of the self I had suppressed for so long. As our business grew, I took charge of the client negotiations and finances. The first time I confidently quoted a high price for our work and had the client agree without blinking, I felt a rush of pride. The woman my parents called irresponsible was closing major deals. I realized that my parents' greatest theft wasn't the money, as significant as that was. It was the theft of my self-esteem. They had conditioned me to believe that I deserved less, that I should expect less, that my purpose was to facilitate the lives of others at my own expense. Rebuilding that sense of self-worth was a far more valuable inheritance than any trust fund, and it was a project I was finally, joyfully, investing in. I saw my brother Leo once, about 2 years after everything imploded. I was in my old city for a work meeting and stopped at a coffee shop I used to frequent. He was at a table in the corner, hunched over a laptop, looking stressed and tired. He had gained weight, and his expensive suit, the kind my father's money used to buy, looked rumpled and ill-fitting. The bravado and effortless confidence he used to wear like a second skin were gone. He looked ordinary, deflated. Our eyes met for a brief, jarring moment. I saw a flash of panic in his, then a familiar flicker of anger, quickly followed by something that looked suspiciously like shame. He quickly looked away, turning his body towards the window as if to erase my presence. I simply picked up my coffee, my hand perfectly steady, and walked out. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no lingering sense of sibling connection. He was just a man in a coffee shop, a stranger with a shared history that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. As I walked to my car, I thought about him more than I had in years. I wondered if he ever felt a shred of guilt, or if he just resented me for turning off the golden tap. I suspected it was the latter. The golden child had lost his shine. Without the constant infusion of my inheritance and my parents' endless financial and emotional support, he was just another person struggling to make his way in the world, a world that didn't automatically cater to his every whim. I realized in that moment that my parents hadn't just failed me, they had failed him too, perhaps even more profoundly. They had coddled him to the point of incompetence, raising a man who had no idea how to stand on his own 2 feet. By giving him everything, they had taught him nothing about resilience, responsibility, or self-respect. In a strange, ironic twist, their favoritism was a curse, and their neglect of me was an accidental gift. It had forced me to be independent, to be resourceful, to be strong. The very qualities they had used as an excuse to withhold my inheritance were the qualities that allowed me to fight for it, and ultimately to thrive without them. My struggle had been my salvation, and his privilege had been his undoing. He was still living out the consequences of their poor parenting, while I had finally managed to break free. As Liam and I built our business from the ground up, I became intimately familiar with contracts, financial statements, and the vital importance of clear, honest communication. I discovered, to my own surprise, that I had a real knack for the financial side of things, a skill born from years of meticulously managing my own meager resources and tracking every penny. The irony was not lost on me. The daughter they had deemed irresponsible with money was now successfully co-running a profitable company, creating financial projections and managing payroll, while my father's own business, as I later found out through industry gossip and a few candid words from my cousin, was struggling badly. Apparently his reputation had taken a significant hit after the sale of his house and the rumors that had begun to circulate. His business was built on relationships and trust, and both had been severely compromised. He had to sell it for a fraction of what it was once worth to cover his debts, many of which were a direct result of the settlement with me. The world my parents had built, a world propped up by my stolen inheritance and their carefully crafted lies, had completely and utterly unraveled. Their social standing, which they valued more than anything, took a massive hit. The truth, in its own quiet way, got out. Friends and neighbors who had once admired them for their apparent success now kept their distance. The beautiful house they had to remortgage, the house that had been the stage for my humiliation, became a symbol not of their success but of their shame. My cousin told me they had to let go of their membership at the golf club, a place that had been the center of their social universe. Their punishment wasn't a dramatic, movie-style downfall. It was a slow, quiet erosion of everything they held dear: their money, their reputation, their family. They ended up with exactly what they had tried to avoid: financial insecurity. And they were alone. They had alienated their only daughter, and their coddled son, now cut off from his endless supply of cash, reportedly kept his distance unless he needed something, which was often. They had sacrificed their integrity and their family for money and status, and in the end they lost it all. Their story became a quiet, suburban tragedy of their own making, a cautionary tale about what happens when you value appearances more than people. Last month, Liam and I got married. It was a small ceremony in the backyard of our house, the one with the garden I had been afraid to want, which was now in full, glorious bloom. We were surrounded by a small group of about 30 close friends, the family we had chosen for ourselves. The sun was shining, and there was a feeling of profound, unadulterated joy in the air. It was a day filled with easy laughter, happy tears, and an overwhelming sense of peace. There were no grand pronouncements, no forced sentimentality, just the quiet, solid joy of two people building a life together on a foundation of trust and truth. My best friend officiated, and our vows were promises we had written ourselves, promises to always be honest, to always be partners, to always be each other's staunchest defenders. As I said my vows to Liam, I looked at his face and saw my entire future, a future I had fought for. It was a future free of manipulation and secrets. After the ceremony, as I looked at the faces of our friends, people who celebrated our successes and supported us without condition, I thought about the word family. For so long I had believed it was something you were born into, an obligation you had to endure no matter the cost. I had been taught that keeping the peace was more important than my own well-being, that loyalty meant accepting mistreatment in silence. But I know now that's not true. Family isn't about blood, it's about respect. It's about showing up for each other, celebrating each other, and protecting each other. It's about who you can count on to be in your corner when the world turns against you. My parents and brother were related to me by blood, but they were not my family. My family was the man standing next to me, his hand warm in mine. My family were the friends laughing in my garden, the people who saw my worth and reflected it back to me. The trust fund my grandparents left was meant to give me a financial head start, but the ordeal of claiming it gave me something far more valuable. It gave me myself. It forced me to find my voice, to build my own boundaries, and to define my own meaning of family and home. That was a legacy far greater than any amount of money. My life today is full, but it is not complicated. It is filled with the simple, profound joys of running a business with my husband, tending to our garden, and spending time with friends who feel like family. The anger I once carried, that constant simmering rage, has faded. It's been replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. I don't miss them. I don't feel a void where my parents and brother used to be. The space they occupied was never filled with genuine love or support. It was filled with anxiety, obligation, and a constant feeling of inadequacy. Removing them from my life wasn't an amputation. It was an extraction, like pulling a tooth that had been aching for years. The relief was immediate and immense. I know they would tell the story differently. In their version, I am the cold, greedy daughter who was manipulated by an outsider and destroyed our perfect family over money. They will forever cast themselves as the loving, misunderstood victims. But I am no longer a character in their story. I am the author of my own. I found the trust fund, yes, but the real treasure was the truth. It validated every instinct I ever had, and it gave me the power to walk away and build a life of my own design, a life where I am valued, respected, and understood. So, let me know what you think. Did I go too far by taking my own family to court, or not far enough?